A woman walks along a country path. She is weary and burdened by the bags on her back. Why does she carry them? There are so many. What's in the bags? Stories. Stories of her life. Stories reaching back to her childhood. They weigh her down. If only she could put the bags down, she could enjoy the day, live in this wonderful moment. But she does not want to put them down. They are the stories of her sadness, of the times when she was hurt, and she clings to them. She believes they protect her from ever being hurt again. But they do not protect her. How can bags filled with sad stories protect her? They just burden her and make the walk slower and more painful. Yet she will not let them go. She stops for a rest and some food. Placing her bags on the floor around her, she reaches in and takes out one of the books. Its covers are worn. She has read it many times. As she takes a bite on her sandwich, she opens the book and begins to read. Emotions swell round her as she takes the story back and goes back into her past. The sadness in her heart, the pain in her stomach, once more awakened and brought back to life, and she remembers why she hates them, as if it had just happened yesterday. The date on the book reads 1971. The year now is 2010. It's almost 40 years old. 40 years old? Has she been reading the same story for so long? The realization shocks her. Surely not 40 years. She lifts her head out of the book and looks at the world around her. So much has changed in all those years. Her looks have faded. The world has become computerized. This book, the one she holds in her hand, had been handwritten. Her newest stories were all in clean, clear type. So much had changed, except for her stories. She looked in the bag again. There were stories that were even older, some even 60 years old. Some were of happy days, but she had not read them in so long. It was the sad stories that she had read the most. It was the sad stories that had their covers bent and were soft at the edges. For so long these stories had been part of her, part of who she was, and yet now, looking down at them, she could just see that they were just old stories, little books, little chapters of her life. She only remembered them because she'd read them so often. What would happen if she threw them away? A vision popped into her mind. She could see herself walking freely along the path, almost as if she were a young girl again. Though the same age as she was now, she looked younger, maybe even 20 years younger. The weight from the bags full of stories had gone. She could see herself and she looked happy, almost bouncing as she walked, free of cares and worries, younger and more alive somehow. Tonight I shall throw them away, she vowed. And that night she did. She emptied out the books, all of them, onto the living room floor and began to sort them, placing the sad stories on one side and the happy stories on the other. And that night, she picked up the sad stories and took them outside to the garden and lit a bonfire and burned them all. A few nights later, her husband came home from a business trip. As he opened the door, he could hear his wife laughing. He was pleased. "What are you so happy about?" he said, poking his head round the door and seeing his wife sitting on the sofa, glee in her eyes, holding open an immaculate book. "It's these stories," she giggled. "They're hilarious. I haven't read them in years." She placed the book down and went to greet her husband, kissed him on the cheek and then said, "I love you," before going into the kitchen. Her husband stood bemused, not quite sure what to make of her sudden outbreak of affection. It wasn't like her at all. He stuttered, not entirely sure what to say. "I love you too," he mumbled, and walked over to the computer table, his usual spot for the evening. And from that day on, there was a change in her for the better, and he never really understood why. But she knew. She was free now, free from the stories, from the ghosts in the stories, free to live her life now, not in the past.